A prejudiced police officer spots a black man in the park and without cause, jumps to the worst conclusion. Acting on pure bias, he slaps on the cuffs, convinced he's caught a criminal. But moments later, the smug certainty drains from his face. He's just arrested a high-ranking FBI agent. Julian Carter exhaled slowly, savoring the crisp autumn air as he turned a page in his book. The afternoon sun filtered through the golden leaves of Lincoln Square Park, casting warm patterns of light and shadow across the worn wooden bench where he sat. It was a rare moment of peace, one he had learned to cherish in a city that never truly rested. The distant laughter of children playing on the jungle gym mixed with the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees, creating a symphony of urban serenity. It had been a long week, filled with back-to-back meetings, closed-door negotiations, and the relentless grind of his job. The world of federal prosecution was exhausting, demanding, and often unforgiving. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of the park, he could momentarily step away from it all. He flipped another page, his eyes scanning the words, though part of his mind remained tuned to his surroundings, a habit ingrained from years of working high-stakes cases. Across the park, Officer Daniel Mercer walked his usual patrol route, his eyes sweeping the area with the keen awareness of a veteran cop. 2 decades on the force had sharpened his instincts, and if there was one thing he prided himself on, it was his ability to sense trouble before it happened. He had learned to trust that feeling in his gut, the one that told him when something wasn't quite right, when someone was out of place. And right now that feeling was gnawing at him. Mercer's gaze settled on the man sitting alone on the bench, his expression unreadable. Tall, well-dressed, too composed, something about him felt off. Mercer slowed his pace, watching. He had patrolled this area for years, knew the regulars by face if not by name, but this guy, he didn't belong. And in Mercer's experience, people who didn't belong were usually up to something. He muttered under his breath, rubbing the back of his neck as he tried to shake the unease. The department had been on high alert after a string of burglaries in the area. The suspect descriptions were vague: male, black, late 30s to early 40s, athletic build. It wasn't much to go on, but to Mercer, it was enough. Maybe this was the break he needed. Maybe he was looking at the guy responsible. Julian felt the weight of someone's gaze and glanced up from his book. His sharp, discerning eyes locked onto Mercer's in an instant, and in that brief moment, Julian recognized the look. He had seen it too many times before. It wasn't the gaze of a curious passerby or a friendly neighborhood patrolman. It was the piercing, calculated stare of someone who had already made up their mind. The look of suspicion disguised as concern, the subtle shift in posture, the tension in the officer's jaw. Julian could read it all as clearly as if Mercer had spoken the words aloud. Julian sighed, closing his book slowly and marking his page with a finger. He'd hoped for a peaceful afternoon, but life had other plans. Mercer took a step forward, then another, his approach deliberate. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but the uncertainty didn't deter him. He had learned that hesitation in this line of work could be dangerous. As he reached the bench, he forced a tight-lipped smile. "Afternoon," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Julian nodded slightly, his voice calm and measured. "Afternoon, officer." Mercer's gaze flicked to the book in Julian's lap before returning to his face. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Julian arched a brow but kept his expression relaxed. "Enjoying the weather. Reading a book." Mercer didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, waiting to see if Julian would offer more, if he would shift uncomfortably, if he would betray anything in his demeanor. But Julian simply held his gaze, unwavering, unafraid. That unsettled Mercer more than he cared to admit. "You from around here?" Mercer asked, his fingers twitching at his side. Julian offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The vague answer irritated Mercer. He had dealt with enough people trying to be clever, trying to dance around questions. His instincts flared again. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he said, his tone firmer now. Julian's smile faded, replaced by something colder. He had been through this before, too many times in too many places, and each time the script was the same. "Am I under arrest?" Julian asked, his voice even. Mercer stiffened. He didn't like that response. It was the kind of thing a guy with something to hide would say. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Mercer shot back. his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. Julian exhaled slowly, glancing at the officer's stance, the way his grip on his belt had tightened. He wasn't in the mood for this, but he also knew how easily situations like this could spiral out of control. He had seen it happen before. Hell, he had prosecuted cases just like this. "I'm just sitting in a park," Julian said, keeping his voice controlled. "Is there a law against that?" Mercer's patience was wearing thin. The man was being difficult, and he wasn't in the mood for games. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how flimsy the excuse sounded. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what description is that, officer?" Mercer's jaw tightened. He had no good answer, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean losing control of the situation. And he couldn't let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID. Now." For a long moment the two men simply stared at each other, the tension between them thickening like a storm cloud. Julian could push back. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public space. But he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation beyond reason. And Julian Carter was many things, but reckless wasn't one of them. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, making sure the officer could see every movement. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open and handing Mercer his ID. Mercer snatched it from his hand, scanning it quickly. The name meant nothing to him. Didn't matter. He had already made his decision. "Stand up," Mercer ordered, stepping back to give Julian room. Julian sighed inwardly, but didn't argue. He rose slowly from the bench, keeping his hands visible, not wanting to give Mercer even the slightest reason to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Mercer said, reaching for his cuffs. A surge of frustration shot through Julian, but he pushed it down. He had learned long ago that reacting in anger never helped. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle in. Not physical exhaustion, but something deeper. The weariness of knowing that no matter what he had accomplished, no matter how hard he had worked, some people would still see him as a suspect first. Mercer, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath Julian's calm expression, gripped his arm and began leading him toward the patrol car. Julian didn't resist, he didn't struggle, he didn't need to. Because soon, very soon, Officer Daniel Mercer was going to realize exactly who he had just arrested. And when that moment came, everything would change. The back seat of the patrol car was uncomfortably cold, the metal of the handcuffs biting into Julian Carter's wrists as he settled into the stiff vinyl seat. He let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable as he gazed out the window. The trees of Lincoln Square Park blurred past, golden autumn leaves swirling in the afternoon breeze, but Julian hardly noticed. His mind was already moving ahead, calculating the inevitable fallout of this arrest. Officer Daniel Mercer sat rigid in the driver's seat, his grip tight on the wheel, knuckles pale beneath the strain. The weight of the interaction still lingered in his chest. Something about that man had unsettled him. The calmness, the certainty. It gnawed at him in a way he couldn't quite place. Julian had played along too easily. That wasn't normal. Mercer had arrested enough people to know when someone was hiding something, and this guy? He was keeping something from him. He was sure of it. Mercer's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, where Julian sat with an air of quiet indifference, his posture relaxed despite the handcuffs. There was no fidgeting, no pleading, no frustration. Most people, innocent or guilty, protested when they were taken in. They panicked, begged for explanations, called for lawyers. Julian Carter had done none of that. Instead, he had merely exhaled and allowed it to happen. And that was the part that bothered Mercer the most. "You got a lot to say back there, or are you just going to keep staring out the window?" Mercer asked, his voice sharp. Julian didn't react immediately. He turned his head slightly, meeting Mercer's gaze through the mirror with a look that sent an uneasy ripple through the officer's chest. "I don't have much to say," Julian replied smoothly. His tone was steady, unshaken. "But I imagine you will soon." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Is that right?" he scoffed, keeping his eyes on the road. Julian tilted his head slightly, considering his words before speaking again. "Tell me, Officer Mercer," he said, his voice calm, measured. "What exactly do you think I've done?" Mercer bristled at the question. "Like I told you, you fit the description of a suspect we've been looking for. A suspect of what, exactly? Julian pressed, his tone not confrontational but pointed. Mercer felt a flicker of irritation. We'll get into that at the station, he muttered. Julian smiled faintly. Right. The silence stretched between them. Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Julian Carter wasn't acting like someone who was afraid of being arrested. He wasn't fighting to prove his innocence or demanding an explanation. No, he was waiting for Mercer to figure it out. Mercer's stomach twisted slightly at the thought. He turned onto a quiet street nearing the precinct when his radio crackled to life. Mercer, you there? It was Officer Ethan Grayson at the front desk. Mercer pressed the button on his radio. Yeah, what's up? There was a pause. Then we got an ID on your guy. Mercer frowned. Yeah, I already got his info. Another pause. Right. Listen, Captain Sinclair wants to see you the second you get here, Grayson said, his voice suddenly laced with something Mercer couldn't quite place. A cold sensation began creeping up Mercer's spine. What's going on? Mercer asked, his grip on the wheel tightening. A longer pause. You should just get here, Grayson finally said. The radio clicked off, leaving only the low hum of the patrol car's engine filling the silence. Mercer swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He checked the rear-view mirror again, but this time Julian wasn't looking at him. He was smiling to himself, just barely. Mercer felt a strange tightness in his chest. This wasn't good. By the time the patrol car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, Mercer was wound so tight he could feel the tension in his shoulders. He shut off the engine and sat for a second, gripping the wheel, trying to slow the gnawing unease twisting in his gut. Julian, on the other hand, remained perfectly composed. Mercer climbed out first, walking around to open the back door. Julian stepped out smoothly, straightening to his full height. Even in cuffs, he carried himself with the same unshaken confidence as before. The two men walked in silence through the entrance of the precinct, the buzz of activity momentarily pausing as heads turned in their direction. Mercer felt it immediately. Something had shifted. Whispers passed between officers at their desks. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Grayson was waiting near the processing desk, his expression tense as he took Julian's ID from Mercer's hand. Captain's waiting, Grayson said, his eyes darting to Julian, then back to Mercer. Mercer nodded, the tightness in his chest worsening. He didn't like this. Julian didn't speak as Mercer led him toward Captain Evelyn Sinclair's office. But Mercer could feel it, that damn waiting, like Julian knew exactly what was coming. Captain Evelyn Sinclair sat behind her desk, the glow of her monitor illuminating the sharp lines of her face. She was a woman who commanded respect the moment she entered a room, and Mercer had never once seen her rattled. But right now, as she looked between him and Julian Carter, something unreadable flickered across her expression. Julian, still cuffed, stepped forward slightly. Captain Sinclair, he said smoothly. Sinclair exhaled, rubbing her temples before fixing Mercer with a look that sent his stomach into freefall. Officer Mercer, she said, her voice dangerously even. Do you have any idea who this man is? Mercer's mouth went dry. Sinclair didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she turned to Grayson, who handed her a printed document. She slid it across the desk toward Mercer. Mercer's eyes flicked down. His breath hitched. Julian Carter, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Federal Prosecutor, specializes in law enforcement misconduct cases. Mercer felt the blood drain from his face. Julian Carter wasn't just any lawyer. He was one of the most powerful prosecutors in the state, and Mercer had just arrested him. For sitting in a park, his heart pounded so loudly he thought the entire room could hear it. Sinclair leaned back, folding her arms. Officer Mercer, she said slowly, you just handcuffed one of the top federal prosecutors in the country, and from what I've seen on your body cam, you did it with zero probable cause. Mercer swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for a way to undo the past 30 minutes. Julian watched him, his expression unreadable. And then, finally, he spoke. Well, he said, voice smooth as ever, this is going to be interesting. Mercer's stomach dropped, because he knew he had just made the worst mistake of his career. The walls of Captain Evelyn Sinclair's office felt closer than usual, the air heavier with an unspoken tension. Officer Daniel Mercer sat stiffly in the chair across from her desk, his jaw tight, hands clenched together to keep them from trembling. A sheen of sweat had gathered at his temples, though he forced himself to appear calm. Beside him, Julian Carter remained impeccably composed, his demeanor unreadable, a man who had been in enough high-stakes rooms to know when he was the one holding all the cards. Sinclair let the silence hang for a moment longer, her sharp gaze flicking between the two men before she finally leaned forward. She folded her hands atop her desk, her expression neutral but firm, like a judge preparing to hand down a verdict. "Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening here," she began, her voice controlled, but layered with a quiet intensity that made Mercer's stomach tighten. "Officer Mercer, you detained and arrested Mr. Carter, one of the most well-respected federal prosecutors in this district, without cause, without evidence, and with clear bias in your actions. Do you understand the weight of that statement?" Mercer swallowed, his throat dry. "Captain, I don't," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "Not yet." Julian had said nothing so far, but the slight curve of his mouth, the quiet patience in his eyes, told Mercer that he was letting Sinclair do the talking, for now. "This is not just a bad arrest," Sinclair continued, her tone sharp, unwavering. "This is a potential public relations nightmare. The moment this story gets out, and trust me, it will get out, this entire department will have to answer for your actions." Mercer shifted in his seat. He could feel the sweat gathering beneath his collar, the pounding in his chest becoming more insistent. Sinclair turned to Julian. "Mr. Carter, I can only assume you'll be filing a formal complaint." Julian smiled faintly. "I'm still weighing my options, Captain." His voice was smooth, his words careful, but Mercer heard the underlying message. "I could ruin you, and you know it." Sinclair sighed, running a hand over her face before she turned back to Mercer. "Walk me through it," she ordered. "From the moment you saw Mr. Carter in the park. I want to know exactly what was going through your head." Mercer hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to defend himself, to salvage what he could of this mess. But he knew there was no easy way out. Not this time. I was patrolling the area," he started, keeping his voice even. "We've had reports of break-ins over the past 2 weeks. The suspect description was vague, but..." He trailed off, realizing too late how weak the justification sounded. Sinclair arched a brow. "Vague?" Mercer shifted uncomfortably. "Black male, mid-30s to 40s, athletic build." Julian let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "That's not a description, Officer Mercer. That's a profile." Mercer felt his face burn. "I was just doing my job," he said quickly. "He was sitting alone, acting suspicious." "What about reading a book in a public park is suspicious?" Julian asked coolly. Mercer exhaled sharply, feeling the walls closing in on him. "It wasn't just that," he muttered. "It was his demeanor. He was too... calm." Julian's brows lifted slightly. "Too calm?" Mercer clenched his jaw. He could hear how ridiculous it sounded, but he couldn't take the words back now. Sinclair pinched the bridge of her nose. "So, let me get this straight. You arrested a man because he was sitting alone, reading, and was... what? Not nervous enough for your liking?" Mercer's silence was all the answer she needed. Sinclair leaned back, folding her arms. "Officer Mercer, do you realize how many times I've had this conversation? How many times I've had to sit across from an officer trying to justify an arrest based on a gut feeling that just so happened to involve a black man minding his own business?" Mercer's stomach twisted. "It wasn't about race," he said quickly, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it anymore. Julian gave him a measured look. "Wasn't it?" Mercer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Sinclair exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Do you understand what this means for you, Mercer? You're looking at a suspension at best. If Mr. Carter decides to pursue legal action, you could be facing a full internal investigation, potential termination." Mercer's heart pounded in his chest. His entire career, everything he had built over the last 2 decades, was on the verge of collapse. He turned to Julian, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. "Look, I made a mistake, all right? I didn't know who you were. If I had known..." Julian's expression hardened. "And that's exactly the problem, Officer Mercer." His voice was still calm, but now there was an edge to it, a quiet power that made Mercer flinch. "My identity shouldn't have mattered. You shouldn't have treated me differently because I have a title. You should have treated me with respect because I'm a human being. Period. Mercer had no response to that. Sinclair watched him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're on administrative leave effective immediately," she said, her tone final. "I'll be forwarding the body cam footage and reports to Internal Affairs for review." Mercer felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. "Captain, you're dismissed, Mercer," Sinclair said, her voice like steel. Mercer hesitated, looking from her to Julian, then back again. For a moment he considered pleading his case, trying to salvage what little he could. But one look at Julian's unwavering gaze told him it would be pointless. With a stiff nod, Mercer rose from his chair, his movements robotic. He turned toward the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. Just as he reached for the handle, Julian spoke again. "One last thing, Officer Mercer." Mercer froze, glancing over his shoulder. Julian's eyes locked onto his, steady and deliberate. "I don't hate you," he said quietly, "but I do hope this makes you think. About your instincts, about your biases, about what they cost people like me." Mercer swallowed hard. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Without another word, he stepped out of the office, closing the door softly behind him. And just like that, everything he had built, everything he had believed about himself, began to crumble. Sinclair let out a long breath, shaking her head before turning back to Julian. "What now?" she asked. Julian studied her for a moment before replying. "Now? We have a conversation about what comes next." Sinclair nodded. "I figured as much." Julian leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "This can't just end with one officer losing his job, Captain. We both know that." Sinclair met his gaze. "I agree." A slow, knowing smile crossed Julian's face. "Good, then let's talk." And as they sat across from each other, the weight of the moment pressing between them, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The weight of the moment lingered long after Officer Daniel Mercer had left the room. Captain Evelyn Sinclair remained seated, watching Julian Carter with quiet contemplation. The air in her office felt thick, charged with something unspoken, something that went beyond the failed arrest and Mercer's suspension. Julian exhaled, resting his elbows on the armrests of his chair, his fingers interlaced in front of him. The composed demeanor he had maintained throughout the ordeal hadn't wavered, but now there was something deeper in his eyes, a quiet exhaustion, not just from the past few hours, but from years of knowing that situations like this, ones exactly like this, were inevitable. "Let's talk," he said finally, breaking the silence. Sinclair leaned back, nodding slightly. She had expected as much. "Go on." Julian studied her for a moment before speaking. "I know Mercer isn't the only one," he said, his tone even but edged with certainty. "He's a symptom of a much bigger issue. One officer facing disciplinary action doesn't fix the culture that allowed him to think what he did was acceptable." Sinclair didn't argue. She had been in this game long enough to know he was right. "I won't make excuses for him," she said, "but I also can't pretend like he's an anomaly. The truth is we still have officers who think like him, who act like him." She sighed. "I'd be lying if I said this department didn't have a problem." Julian tilted his head slightly. "Then let's fix it." Sinclair's brows lifted. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," Julian admitted. "But it's necessary." She let out a slow breath, rubbing her temples before leveling her gaze at him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Julian leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Reform. Real, structural reform." Sinclair folded her arms, skeptical but intrigued. "You do realize how difficult that is, right?" "I do," Julian said, "and I also realize how impossible it is to ignore. If this department doesn't address the issue, someone else will. And trust me, it won't be handled in a closed-door conversation like this." Sinclair knew exactly what he meant. The media would rip them apart if word of this arrest got out. The department would be branded as corrupt, negligent. Protests, scrutiny, lawsuits, it was all on the table. "You want policy changes," she guessed. Julian nodded. "Starting with how officers are trained to handle implicit bias and de-escalation. How often do you even have those trainings?" Sinclair hesitated. "We have the standard." Julian cut her off with a knowing look. Standard isn't enough. You and I both know that. Sinclair sighed. And what else? Julian didn't hesitate. Accountability. Internal reviews that aren't just for show. Officers like Mercer need to understand that if they act on bias, if they let assumptions dictate their decisions, there will be consequences. Sinclair tapped her fingers against her desk. It's a nice idea, but it's not that simple. Nothing worth doing ever is, Julian replied smoothly. She smirked slightly at that, but didn't argue. You're not just here as a prosecutor, are you? Julian shook his head. I'm here as someone who knows what it's like to be on the other end of that badge, and as someone who's tired of watching nothing change. Sinclair considered him for a long moment before sighing. All right, she said finally. We start with a full review of training protocols, a deep dive into how officers are taught to assess threats, to recognize their own biases, and we enforce actual accountability when things go wrong. Julian nodded, but his eyes remained sharp. And what about Mercer? Sinclair hesitated. He's under review. Review doesn't mean much if he's back on the streets in 6 months, Julian said bluntly. Sinclair exhaled. I'll be honest with you. I don't know if he can change, but I do know that if we don't force him to confront what he did, we might as well be endorsing it. Julian studied her, then nodded slightly. That's a start. Outside the precinct, Mercer sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The past hour had been a blur. The moment he stepped out of Sinclair's office, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on him. He had made a mistake, a terrible, career-altering mistake. The worst part? He had been so sure, so damn sure that his instincts had been right. But they weren't. Julian Carter wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a threat. And yet, Mercer had treated him like one. He let out a shaky breath, leaning his head back against the seat. His badge, his career, his reputation, it was all in jeopardy. But beyond that, something deeper gnawed at him. For the first time in a long time, he was questioning himself. What if Julian Carter had been just another man? What if he hadn't been a prosecutor, but just someone with no power, no platform? Would Mercer have even hesitated? Would he have realized his mistake at all? The truth made him sick. A knock at his window startled him. He turned, heart pounding, only to see Julian Carter standing there, looking at him with an expression Mercer couldn't quite place. With a deep breath, Mercer rolled down the window. Julian leaned slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the door. You look like a man who's got a lot on his mind, he said. Mercer swallowed hard. That's one way to put it. Julian studied him for a long moment before speaking again. I don't hate you, Mercer. Mercer looked away. I wouldn't blame you if you did. That's not the point, Julian said. The point is, what are you going to do now? Mercer hesitated. I don't know. Julian nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. Then figure it out, he said simply. Mercer frowned. You really think I can just change? Julian tilted his head. I think that's up to you. Mercer exhaled, staring at the dashboard for a long time before nodding. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess it is. Julian straightened, stepping back from the car. See you round, Officer Mercer. Mercer watched him walk away, his thoughts a tangled mess of regret, realization, and something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the first spark of understanding, or maybe it was the beginning of something else entirely. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. Things couldn't stay the same. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted them to. Inside the precinct, Captain Sinclair watched as Julian Carter walked away, her arms crossed. Detective Lucas Monroe stepped beside her. You think Mercer will change? Sinclair let out a slow breath. I think he's got a choice to make, Monroe smirked. And if he makes the wrong one? Sinclair's expression hardened. Then we make sure he's not in a position to do this to someone else. Monroe nodded. Fair enough. Sinclair turned back to her office, glancing one last time at the door before muttering, One down. A hell of a lot more to go. And with that, she closed the door behind her. Because the work was only just beginning. The precinct was quieter than usual the following morning. The usual murmur of officers chatting over coffee, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards, and the occasional ring of a desk phone seemed muffled, muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just any day. It was the day Mercer would learn his fate. Julian Carter walked through the station doors with his usual air of quiet confidence, but there was something different today, something heavier in his posture, in his expression. This wasn't just about one officer's career anymore. It was about what would come next, about whether anything would truly change. Captain Evelyn Sinclair was waiting for him. She stood just outside her office, arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unreadable. The moment their eyes met, she gave him a subtle nod before turning and walking inside. He followed, closing the door behind him. Julian took a seat across from her desk, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of the chair. Sinclair sat down as well, letting out a slow breath before speaking. "Mercer's hearing is in an hour," she said, watching him closely. Julian nodded, unsurprised. "And what's your recommendation?" Sinclair leaned forward, folding her hands together. "I'm torn," she admitted. "Mercer screwed up, badly. But I've also seen officers make mistakes and learn from them. The question is, does he even want to?" Julian's expression didn't change. "And what does your gut say?" Sinclair sighed. "My gut says he's shaken, that he's not the same man he was before this happened. Whether that's enough, I don't know." Julian studied her for a moment before speaking. "He's got a decision to make," he said. "And so do you." Sinclair let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "You have a way of cutting through the nonsense, Carter." He smiled faintly. "It's a skill." Sinclair's expression turned serious again. "So, what do you want? You could push for him to be fired outright. Given the evidence, no one would stop you." Julian was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "I don't want Mercer gone just for the sake of it," he said. "I want him to understand what he did. I want him to be part of the solution, not just another cautionary tale." Sinclair considered his words carefully before nodding. "All right," she said. "Let's see what happens." The conference room was filled with a tense, expectant silence. Officer Daniel Mercer sat at the far end of the table, his hands folded in his lap. He looked different today, less sure of himself, less rigid in his convictions. The past few days had done something to him, something he wasn't entirely sure how to process. Sinclair entered first, followed closely by Julian and Detective Lucas Monroe. A few other high-ranking officers were present, each of them wearing unreadable expressions. Mercer stood as protocol dictated, but when Sinclair motioned for him to sit, he obeyed without question. "Officer Mercer," Sinclair began, her voice firm but not unkind, "this is your formal hearing. You've had time to review the case against you, to reflect on your actions. Now, we're going to talk about what happens next." Mercer nodded, his throat tightening. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him. Sinclair continued. "We have two options. The first is simple. You resign, you walk away, and this department moves forward without you." Mercer swallowed hard, but he didn't say anything. "The second," Sinclair went on, "is more complicated. You stay, but under strict conditions. You undergo mandatory retraining, extensive racial bias workshops, and are placed on probation for a year. One mistake, just one, and you're out." Mercer glanced at Julian, whose expression remained unreadable. "You mean I get to keep my job?" Mercer asked, his voice quiet, hesitant. Sinclair's gaze hardened. "Not like before. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about whether we can trust you to be better, to do better. Because if you can't, you have no business wearing that badge." Mercer felt his heart pound against his ribs. He had spent the past few nights lying awake, replaying every moment of that arrest in his mind. He had been so damn sure at the time, so sure that his instincts were right. But instincts weren't supposed to be poisoned by bias, and that was the part that haunted him. Mercer hesitated, licking his lips before speaking again. "I want to stay." Sinclair narrowed her eyes slightly. "Why?" Mercer exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. "Because if I leave now, I walk away from this unchanged. I don't want to pretend like this never happened. I don't want to be the same officer I was a week ago." He met Julian's gaze directly for the first time. "I don't expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I do want to make this right, however I can." Julian studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Making this right doesn't mean just getting through probation, Mercer," he said evenly. "It means changing how you think. It means checking your instincts and asking yourself why you see certain people as threats before they've done anything to deserve that label. Mercer swallowed hard. I understand. Sinclair watched him carefully before nodding. Then you start today. Training begins next week. Dismissed. Mercer stood, his legs feeling heavier than before. He gave Julian a small nod before turning toward the door, but before he could leave, Julian spoke again. Mercer. He turned back. This isn't the end, Julian said simply. This is the start of something harder. Don't waste it. Mercer nodded once before walking out the door. A week later, Julian sat in a different office, this time overlooking the city skyline. The events of the past days had sparked conversations far beyond the precinct. A news article sat on his desk, the headline bold, Reform or Reputation. Police department faces, reckoning after wrongful arrest of federal prosecutor. Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. The world was watching. A knock at the door made him glance up. Captain Sinclair stepped inside, arms crossed. Figured you'd want an update, she said. Julian nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Mercer started training today, Sinclair said, leaning back in her chair. Monroe says he actually asked questions, engaged with the material. Julian smirked. That's a start. Sinclair tilted her head. Do you think he'll actually change? Julian considered the question carefully before replying. I think he wants to. That's more than most. Sinclair exhaled. And you? What's next for you? Julian glanced at the newspaper again before setting it aside. There's always more work to be done. Sinclair chuckled. You don't know how to rest, do you? Julian smiled faintly. Not when there's still so much left to fix. They sat in silence for a moment, the city stretching out beyond the window, a reminder that progress was slow but possible. Change didn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere, and for Julian Carter, this was just the beginning. The city was restless. It had been weeks since the wrongful arrest of Julian Carter, but the ripple effects continued to spread. Discussions of bias in law enforcement were no longer just whispers among advocacy groups or heated debates on social media. They were on the front pages of newspapers, dissected in televised panels, and questioned in city hall meetings. The precinct itself was under intense scrutiny, forced to reckon with its practices, its leadership, and the culture that had allowed Officer Daniel Mercer to act on an assumption that could have destroyed a man's life. Julian Carter had never sought to be at the center of a controversy, but he wasn't naive enough to ignore the moment. The sun hung low in the sky as he stepped out of his office, briefcase in hand. His team had been working non-stop, not just on Mercer's case, but on the broader issue at hand. What happened to him was just one incident in a system that had long operated unchecked, and if real change was going to happen, it couldn't just end with one officer's retraining. As he descended the courthouse steps, a familiar figure leaned against a parked patrol car across the street. Mercer. Julian didn't react immediately. Instead, he took a moment to study the man who only weeks ago had looked at him with suspicion in a park for nothing more than sitting in silence. Mercer looked different. The arrogance, the quiet assumption of control, both were gone. In their place was something Julian hadn't expected. Unease, maybe even remorse. Carter, Mercer greeted, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Mercer, Julian replied evenly. Surprised to see you here. The officer nodded toward the courthouse. I figured you'd be in there late. He hesitated before exhaling sharply. Look, I know you don't owe me anything, but I needed to talk. Julian arched a brow, but nodded. Go on. Mercer ran a hand through his short cropped hair, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. I've been going through the training, he said. The bias workshops, the de-escalation courses, the lectures from experts telling me everything I did wrong. He let out a bitter chuckle. You ever sit through hours of someone dissecting every mistake you've ever made in your career? Julian folded his arms, his gaze steady. I prosecute corrupt cops for a living. I've seen it happen in a courtroom. Difference is, most don't get a second chance. Mercer winced at the reminder, but nodded. Fair enough. He sighed, glancing up at the sky as if searching for the right words. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I see it now. Not just what I did, but what it means. What it says about how I've been doing this job for years, and it's been messing with me. Julian watched him carefully, waiting, Mercer's voice dropped slightly. I've always thought of myself as one of the good guys, the kind of cop who looks out for people, who keeps the city safe. But I've been realizing that just because I meant well doesn't mean I was doing the right thing. It doesn't erase the damage I've caused, and I don't know what to do with that. For the first time since their encounter, Julian saw something raw in Mercer's eyes. Doubt. Not just about the situation, but about himself. Julian took a slow breath. You can't change the past, Mercer. You can't undo what happened that day in the park, or however many other times you made assumptions without even realizing it. But you can decide what kind of officer you're going to be moving forward. That's your choice. Mercer nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling over him. He hesitated before asking, "Do you think people like me can actually change?" Julian studied him for a long moment before answering. "I think people can change when they actually want to, but you can't do it for a job, or because you're afraid of losing your badge. You have to want to change for the right reasons." Mercer exhaled heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I'm figuring that out." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't tense. It was something else, something unfamiliar. Finally, Julian nodded. "Good." He stepped back, preparing to leave, but before he did, he added, "You came here to tell me this, Mercer." "That tells me something. Now let's see what you do with it." Mercer watched as Julian walked away, disappearing into the evening crowd. For the first time in his career, he didn't have all the answers, and maybe that was the first step in the right direction. The following weeks brought waves of changes, both in the precinct and in the city. Captain Evelyn Sinclair pushed forward with the reforms Julian had demanded: mandatory training on racial bias, increased oversight on officer conduct, and stricter policies on de-escalation. But more than policies, there was a shift in the atmosphere. Officers who once brushed off discussions of race and accountability were now forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Some resisted, but others, like Mercer, found themselves questioning the way they had always operated. One day, Julian received a call from Sinclair. "I need you to come down to the precinct," she said, her voice unreadable. "Something wrong?" Julian asked, "and just get here." When Julian arrived, Sinclair was waiting outside her office, arms crossed. Next to her stood Mercer. Julian arched a brow. "This feels familiar." Sinclair smirked. "Yeah, except this time Mercer isn't here to explain why he put you in cuffs." Julian glanced at Mercer, who met his gaze without flinching. "What's this about?" Julian asked. Sinclair gestured toward Mercer. "Go ahead." Mercer cleared his throat. "I want to be part of the training," he said. "The workshops, the discussions about bias, the community meetings. I want to help." Julian blinked, caught slightly off guard. "You want to help?" Mercer nodded. "Look, I can't change what I did, and I sure as hell don't expect people to forgive me for it. But if there's something I can do to make sure other officers don't make the same mistakes, I need to do it." Julian studied him, looking for any sign that this was just an attempt at redemption to save his career. But there was something in Mercer's eyes, something real. Sinclair sighed. "He's been persistent about it." Julian exhaled. "All right," he said. "Then prove it." Mercer nodded, determination settling over his face. "I will." Months later, Julian sat in the back of a packed conference hall watching Mercer address a room full of young cadets. "The biggest mistake you can make as an officer isn't hesitating before drawing your weapon," Mercer said. "It's assuming you already know everything." The room was silent. Mercer continued. "For years I trusted my instincts without questioning where they came from. I thought being a good cop meant relying on what felt right. But what felt right was just years of unchecked bias. And one day it almost cost a man his dignity, and it damn near cost me my career." Julian watched as Mercer took a slow breath before finishing. "I'm not here to tell you I got it all figured out. I'm here to tell you that you can't afford to make the same mistakes I did." The room erupted into applause. Julian leaned back in his chair, a slow smile crossing his lips. Change didn't happen overnight. But sometimes it started in the most unexpected places. The rain drizzled lightly over the city, a soft mist clinging to the pavement as Julian Carter stepped out of the courthouse. It had been months since his wrongful arrest, but the echoes of that day still lingered, not just in his mind, but in the city itself. The conversation it had sparked had grown beyond him, beyond Mercer, beyond one precinct's failure. Now, it was a movement, a reckoning that demanded more than just apologies and training sessions. It demanded change. He adjusted his coat, his eyes scanning the street as cars rolled by, their headlights cutting through the dim afternoon haze. Across the street, the precinct stood, its walls the same as always, but inside, something was shifting. He could feel it. The city wasn't the same, and neither was Officer Daniel Mercer. Julian spotted him a few feet away, standing near the entrance of a community center, talking to a small group of officers and civilians. The sight was almost surreal. The same man who had once put him in cuffs for doing nothing at all was now actively engaged in conversations about de-escalation, bias, and police reform. A few months ago, Julian would have thought it impossible. Now he wasn't so sure. Taking a slow breath, Julian crossed the street, stepping onto the sidewalk just as Mercer noticed him. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was no tension, just acknowledgement. Mercer gave a small nod before excusing himself from the conversation. As he approached, Julian caught the faint exhaustion in his features. The weight that came with realizing change wasn't as simple as attending a few workshops. "Didn't expect to see you here," Mercer said, tucking his hands into his pockets. Julian smirked. "Didn't expect to see you leading discussions on bias training." Mercer let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, life's funny like that." A brief silence stretched between them before Mercer sighed, his expression turning serious. "Listen, Carter, I know a few months of training doesn't erase what happened. And I know that no matter what I do, there are people who won't trust me. I get it. I don't blame them." Julian studied him, searching for any trace of resentment or defensiveness. He found none. "That's not why you're doing this, though, is it?" Julian asked. Mercer shook his head. "No," he admitted. "I spent too many years thinking I had everything figured out, that my instincts were enough. But I've been wrong before, about a lot of things. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." Julian exhaled, leaning against the railing of the community center steps. "Change isn't easy," he said. "It's slow, it's messy, and most of the time it's uncomfortable." Mercer huffed a laugh. "Yeah, I'm learning that the hard way." Julian glanced at the small group Mercer had been speaking to. Among them were young officers, community leaders, and even a few civilians who had been vocal about their distrust of the police. That Mercer had willingly put himself in a space where he had to answer for his past actions said more than any apology ever could. "People will always judge you based on what you've done, not what you plan to do," Julian said. "That's not unfair. It's reality." Mercer nodded. "I know. But that doesn't mean I stopped trying." Julian watched him for a moment before nodding. "Then don't." Another silence stretched between them, not heavy, not tense, but filled with something neither of them could quite name. "Are you heading inside?" Mercer asked, gesturing toward the community center doors. Julian considered it for a moment before shaking his head. "Not tonight," he said. "This is your thing." Mercer raised a brow. "You sure? You're kind of the reason all this started." Julian smirked. "Yeah, but you're the one who has to prove he belongs here." Mercer let out a quiet laugh, nodding. "Fair enough." Julian pushed off the railing, adjusting his coat. "I'll be watching, though." "I figured," Mercer said. With that, Julian turned and walked away, disappearing into the city streets, leaving Mercer standing at the steps of the community center, staring after him. For the first time in his career, Mercer wasn't looking for an easy way out. He wasn't looking to justify, to excuse, to convince himself that his past actions didn't matter. He knew they did. He also knew that change wasn't about making people forget. It was about making sure they had a reason to believe in something better. And that, Mercer thought as he took a deep breath and stepped back inside, was exactly what he intended to do. The story of Julian Carter and Officer Daniel Mercer isn't just a fictional narrative. It's a reflection of real-life issues we see unfolding in society every day. The wrongful arrest, the underlying biases, and the slow, often painful journey toward accountability and change mirror the conversations happening across cities, workplaces, and institutions around the world. We live in a time where systemic injustices are being challenged more than ever, where people are demanding fairness, and where those in positions of power are being held accountable for their actions. Yet, the real question remains: can people truly change? Can someone like Mercer, who has spent years operating under ingrained biases, unlearn and become part of the solution? The lesson here is that change is uncomfortable, but it is possible if we are willing to listen, reflect, and take action. It's not enough to simply acknowledge the problem. Real progress happens when individuals take responsibility, actively educate themselves, and commit to doing better. Whether in law enforcement, workplaces, or everyday interactions, we must challenge assumptions, recognize our own biases, and ensure that justice is not determined by someone's race, gender, or background. The road to change is long and full of resistance, but it starts with individuals making the choice to be different, to be better. Julian's decision to push for reform rather than revenge, and Mercer's willingness to confront his own prejudices, remind us that transformation isn't about words. It's about consistent, intentional action. In today's world, that lesson is more relevant than ever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.